Alright, we're going to discuss parts of a chainsaw tooth today. Before we get too heavy into that, some safety stuff. Number one, chains are sharper on the front edge of the tooth than the back. Because of that, anytime you advance the chain, you're going to want to push it forward, don't pull it back. That way, you're less likely to cut your hands, you won't be pulling back. Second of all, hands are soft. You're going to want to wear gloves for this. I don't have gloves on right now because I need to fine motor control to use my pointer and show you what I'm looking at. Alright, so on our particular tooth, we've got a couple pieces. This is the actual cutter itself that does all the wood removal. Over here, you have your depth gauge / raker. This is a safety chain, that's why there are two pieces to it. The idea is that as this is going around the tip of your bar, it's less likely to result in a kickback. When you're sharpening, if you look at this little line carved into your tooth right there, that's the angle that you want to mimic with your file. If you change the angle like this, you're going to have a very pointy tooth, and that tip is going to be unsupported because there's not enough metal behind it, because it's unsupported, because there's not enough metal behind it, it's going to bend more easily. If you go the other direction and go too square, then you're going to end up with a chain that's really good for ripping, but not so good for cross-cutting. If you do not adjust the height of your depth gauge, you're going to have to find a way to get this cutter engaged. The only way you're going to do that is by pushing hard. That's going to create a lot of heat and friction and wear out your bar real quick. So you're going to want to adjust your depth gauge every couple of times you sharpen, usually about every 3 times. I sharpen differently depending on what I'm doing with the saw. If I'm limbing, I want it to cut a little bit more aggressively, so I'll put my depth gauge a little bit lower. That's because I'm only going to have a couple of these cutters engaged with the wood at any given time. If I'm cutting something really big, then I want each tooth taking off less material because my whole bar is going to be engaged in the log. The rule of thumb in general, I believe, is about 50 thou. You can get gauges. I do it by feel. I've done this enough that I know where I like my depth gauge. So the reason that we can't use a round file on its own to sharpen, well, you can, but you shouldn't, is there's nothing to keep it from sharpening too deep in the gullet there. You need the round file high enough up that part of the circle is above the top of this cutter. That way you get the correct angle on the tooth to actually remove metal. I use this as my tool to prevent my file from getting too deep in the gullet. On my tooth, I will place it flat on top of my chain. I do not want it angled down or angled up at all. There are lines scribed on here to show the correct angle. I can line those up with the bar, or I can look at the lines on top of the teeth that I mentioned previously. When I'm using this, I'm going to do the same number of strokes on each tooth. If I do one stroke here, the next tooth gets one, the next tooth gets one, so on and so forth. I never want to do a whole bunch of strokes on one tooth. I want to do it the same on every single one so they're cutting evenly. I also want to balance the left side cutters and right side cutters. If I do not do that, if I only sharpen the left side cutters, my chain is not going to cut straight. The kerf is going to curve in the log if I do that. Likewise, if you hit a rock with only the right side cutters, then your chain is going to still curve because some cutters aren't cutting. When I'm using this tool, I only push away from myself with it. The reason I do that is because files are meant to cut on the push stroke. Does it hurt it if you drag back in the cut? There's conjecture. It sounds like mostly no. However, it's really easy to ding up the point of that tooth, and that point is critical. This is called full chisel chain, which means that the front profile of the tooth forms a 90-degree angle. If it were semi-chisel, it'd be more of a round angle. Since I have full chisel, the point is extra critical for cutting. If I dull that by dragging back, I've defeated the whole point of sharpening my chain. I'm going to use my flat file to adjust my depth gauge now. It makes a god-awful noise if you push it opposite the direction of your cutter. So to avoid that, I do all my left side cutters. Then I change my file angle around, do all my right side cutters. The depth gauge here is in front of the tooth. You do not want to hit the tooth with the edge of this file because it's going to dull it. Because of that, I'll tend to put my hand there and brace it against my hand so I'm not filing the tooth. To be clear, I'm not filing the top of my cutter, I'm filing my depth gauge. It doesn't take a lot. I'll do a single stroke or two usually, and that's all you need. If you ever want to take a look and see what your depth gauges are actually set to, just put something flat on top and look at how much space there is between the depth gauge and whatever that flat piece of something is. Usually I'll use my bar cover because that's soft. There's a straight edge on there, and that works pretty well for that task.